The night erupted in chaos as Redwillow burned, flames leaping from rooftop to rooftop, swallowing the town in a furious storm of heat and smoke. Horses screamed in their stalls. Bells clanged from the church tower before the roof gave way in a thunder of sparks. Survivors stumbled through the gates of Holloway Ranch, clutching children, coughing through soot. Inside, lanterns blazed as Clara Wynn commanded the transformation. Tables became operating cots, kitchens boiled water for poultices, every hand put to work. Flames turned the night sky over Redwillow into a sea of fire. Screams tore through the wind until the doors burst open and Thomas Monroe lay in her path, forcing her to choose between old wounds and a life in her hands. The Wyoming wilderness lay locked beneath a sheet of ice, the kind of cold that gnawed straight through wool and bone. Grant Holloway leaned low in the saddle, his coat snapping in the wind as his stallion pushed against drifts that swallowed its fetlocks. Each breath from man and horse puffed white into the air before being shredded by the gale. Out here, in the frozen silence, the only sounds were the crunch of hooves and the low, steady creak of leather. Grant had been riding since dawn, checking the far line of his property after a week of relentless storms. Snow stung his face like shards of glass, and the horizon was nothing but a smear of gray. Then as he crested a shallow rise, something broke the monotony. A small, weather-beaten structure hunched beside the tracks. An old station, abandoned long ago when the rail shifted its course. Still, something about it tugged at his instincts. He reined in. The wind roared in his ears as he swung down, boots sinking into the crusted snow. The door groaned when he pushed it open, revealing a dim interior no warmer than the world outside. A few warped boards leaned against the wall, the only shelter from the storm. And there, in the far corner, a figure lay curled on the floor. She was so still he thought she might already be gone. Then he saw the faint cloud of her breath. Her eyelashes were clumped with frost, her cheeks mottled pale and raw from windburn. Snowmelt dampened her tangled hair. She clutched a battered leather satchel to her chest, its surface stamped faintly with a red cross. The fingers gripping the strap were white and rigid, yet they refused to let go. Grant knelt, brushing the snow from her shoulder. "Miss?" His voice was low but firm. Her eyelids fluttered open, revealing eyes clouded with exhaustion, but sharpened by something fierce. Her lips trembled as she whispered, "Can't leave it. Someone might need it." The words broke apart in a shiver. Even half frozen, she was guarding her tools, her purpose. Grant hesitated only a second before easing the satchel from her arms and tucking it inside his own coat. Then he wrapped his scarf around her neck and slid his arms beneath her slight frame. She was frighteningly light. Stepping back into the wind, Grant mounted with her cradled against him, turning toward Holloway Ranch. Whatever her story was, he knew one thing for certain. He had found a survivor. Grant's stallion thundered through the drifts, the storm snapping at them like a pack of wolves. Clara Wynn lay cradled against his chest, her head lolling weakly against the rough wool of his coat. Every so often he felt the faint, shallow pull of her breath against his collarbone, just enough to reassure him she was still alive. He leaned forward into the wind, pushing the horse harder, every instinct urging him toward the warmth of home. By the time the sprawling log house of Holloway Ranch emerged from the snow haze, Grant's gloves were stiff with ice and his shoulders ached from holding her so close. He dismounted in one fluid motion, keeping Clara in his arms. The front door swung wide beneath his boot, letting in a swirl of cold before it thudded shut behind them. Inside, the air was warmer, faintly scented with the ash and pine of a fire that had burned earlier. He carried her down the quiet hallway to a small room at the end, a nursery long unused, its walls still faintly painted with faded clouds and meadows. Setting her gently on the bed, he pulled two thick wool blankets over her slight frame. She stirred but did not fully wake. Her lips were cracked, her face pale under the frostbite blush. Grant crossed to the hearth and coaxed the embers into flame, adding kindling until the fire cast a steady orange glow. Then he brought a basin of warm water, carefully pressing a damp cloth to her forehead. The fever came in waves. One moment she shivered violently. The next she sweated through the thin blouse clinging to her skin. Her satchel sat beside the bed, still dusted with snow. Grant studied it for a moment before picking it up. Without opening it, he walked to the kitchen and set it high above the shelves, beyond casual reach. a thing guarded that fiercely deserved respect. Later, as she woke briefly, her voice was a hoarse whisper. I shouldn't be here. I don't want to impose. Her gaze darted to where her bag had been. Grant met her eyes, steady and unyielding. You've already repaid me, by holding on to what mattered most. For a moment, something flickered across her face. Surprise, perhaps even relief, before exhaustion pulled her back into sleep. The first days after the rescue passed in a slow rhythm of recovery. Clara spent them bundled in blankets, sipping broth, and staring out at the white fields that stretched beyond Holloway Ranch. But each morning her color returned a little more. Her steps grew steadier, and her hands itched for work. It began with a cough, sharp and dry, from Eli, the youngest ranch hand. He tried to shrug it off, but Clara's ear caught the strain in his breathing. She cornered him gently in the bunkhouse, a kettle steaming beside her. From her satchel, she pulled sprigs of dried mullein and a pinch of licorice root, steeping them into a tea that smelled faintly of earth and sweetness. Sip it slow, she instructed, her tone soft but certain. By the next day, Eli's cough had eased, and word quietly began to spread. When the ranch hand's children came to visit on Sundays, Clara found ways to make herself useful without fanfare. She turned hand-washing into a game, singing a lilting rhyme as they scrubbed between fingers and under nails. No sickness sails when clean hands set the sails. The children laughed, repeating it until they could sing it without her help. At the long dining table, Clara's touch appeared in subtle ways. Small sachets of thyme and rosemary tucked beside each plate, a jar of crushed cloves near the bread, a pot of mint tea that at first the cowboys eyed suspiciously, but soon drank without complaint. Even old Hank, who once claimed green stuffs for rabbits, was caught sipping her elderflower tonic on cold nights. Through it all, Grant Holloway watched. Known across the territory for his iron reserve, he had always eaten alone, sometimes on the porch, sometimes in the barn, anywhere but among the noise of others. Yet now he lingered. At first he stood in the doorway, arms crossed, saying nothing. Then he began to take the far seat at the table, quiet and watchful. Clara never called attention to it. She passed him the bread with a nod, smiled when their eyes met, and went on with her work. But she noticed the way his shoulders eased, the faint lines around his eyes softening. And though the ranch was still wrapped in winter, there was a warmth at the table now, one that came not from the fire, but from the slow, deliberate breaking of solitude. The night was cold and still, the kind that carried every sound across the frozen prairie. Grant had just stepped onto the porch when he saw it, an unnatural glow bleeding into the sky above the distant hills. At first he thought it was the moon breaking through clouds, but then the light pulsed, flickered, and began to swell. Fire. The horizon blazed in angry orange, too tall and restless for a barn fire, too wide for a single home. It was the heart of Redwillow. The wind shifted, and with it came the faint, acrid scent of smoke. Somewhere far off, a bell clanged, a frantic, uneven rhythm. Grant didn't waste a second. "Saddle up," he barked, his voice cutting through the dark. Men scrambled from the bunkhouse. He swung into the saddle and tore off toward the town, barking orders to cut the west fence for incoming wagons and light torches to guide the way. Back at Holloway Ranch, Clara stepped into the yard, her scarf whipping in the wind as she stared at the growing inferno on the horizon. She didn't wait for instructions. "Boil every pot we have," she told the kitchen staff. "Clear the feed room, use blankets for bedding, lay every bandage you can find on the dining table." The ranch shifted into a different kind of battle. Lanterns sprang to life in every window. Ranch hands hauled in barrels of water and stacked them by the door. Women and older children carried armfuls of clean linens from the upstairs closets, the air filled with the mingled scents of boiling herbs, comfrey, willow bark, chamomile. The first wagon arrived just after midnight. A mother stumbled down, clutching a coughing child to her chest. Behind her came a miner with burns streaking up both arms. Then more, faces blackened with soot, eyes wide and dazed. Clara moved through them like the eye of a storm. She soothed, she commanded, she stitched and bandaged. Her voice was firm, steady, each order precise. By the time the third wagon pulled in, the ranch was no longer a home. It was a field hospital. Tables became operating stations. The kitchen floor was lined with pallets for the wounded. Outside, the fire still painted the sky, but inside, Clara Wynn fought it with every skill and every heartbeat she had left to give. The night had settled into a relentless rhythm. Wounded in, treated, sent to rest. When the dining hall doors banged open again, a ranch hand stumbled through, smoke clinging to his coat, carrying a boy limp in his arms. The child's head lolled, his face streaked with soot and sweat. Clara was already moving toward them when she saw it. Blonde hair matted with blood, a boy's features pale beneath the grime. The rescuer's voice cracked as he spoke. Found him under the hospital rubble. Could barely get him free. She knelt beside the cot they'd cleared, pressing 2 fingers to his neck. The pulse was there, but faint. His breathing was ragged, shallow, every inhale catching like a frayed rope. Then the rescuer whispered the name, Thomas. Thomas Monroe. The sound hit her harder than the wind howling outside. Thomas Monroe, the son of Dr. Everett Monroe, the man who had once looked her in the eye and, with cold precision, dismantled her career. Unfit, uncertified, unworthy. He'd burned her reputation in the eyes of the medical board, making sure no hospital would take her. For a heartbeat, the room shrank to just her and the boy. From across the table, Grant's gaze found hers. His voice was quiet, but it carried weight. Do what you can. Clara's jaw tightened, but her hands didn't hesitate. She called for hot water and a clean cloth, crushing marshmallow root and mullein leaves in a mortar until they formed a fragrant paste. She spread it onto a square of linen, binding it gently across the boy's chest to draw the smoke from his lungs. Next came the breathing, steady, rhythmic pressure to coax air back in. She dabbed cool water at his temples, loosening the blood-caked hair to reveal a gash. With deft stitches, she closed the wound, never pausing, never letting the memories creep into her hands. Hours blurred into each other. She stayed beside him, changing cloths, listening for the hitch in his breath to ease. Finally, just as dawn's first gray light crept into the room, his chest rose in one deep, clean inhale. Then another. Clara sat back, her own breath shaky. Around them, the ranch exhaled as if they had all been holding it. She didn't look for thanks. She didn't need it. The boy would live, and that was enough. By dawn, the fires in Redwillow had begun to smolder, leaving only pillars of black smoke curling into a pale morning sky. The wounded at Holloway Ranch lay wrapped in blankets, the air heavy with the mingled scents of ash and simmering herbs. In hushed voices, the story spread from cot to cot, mouth to mouth. How the nurse they'd once dismissed, the one thrown out by the medical board, had worked through the night and saved not only dozens of strangers, but also young Thomas Monroe. Men who had once passed Clara without a glance now stopped at her side, pressing her hand or murmuring a simple, "Thank you." Women she had never met brought jars of broth, fresh bread, and clean linen, laying them silently on the table before slipping back out. Even the ranch hands seemed to move differently around her, with a respect that had nothing to do with politeness and everything to do with what they'd seen her do when it mattered most. Late in the morning, a shadow fell across the threshold. Dr. Everett Monroe stood there, soot-stained and worn, his hat in one hand. For a long moment, he said nothing, his gaze fixed on his son, sleeping peacefully under Clara's watch. Finally, he stepped forward, stopping just short of her. "You saved him," he said, his voice low, almost reluctant. Clara's eyes stayed on the boy. "He's breathing clear now. He'll heal." The doctor's jaw worked as if there were more he wanted to say, but in the end, he simply inclined his head. "Thank you." She didn't look at him, didn't need to. Gratitude, however genuine, could not rewrite the past. But in that moment, it also didn't matter. Her work spoke louder than any apology. The weeks after the fire passed in a blur of healing and rebuilding, the townsfolk of Redwillow slowly returned to what remained of their homes, and the makeshift hospital at Holloway Ranch emptied one bed at a time. Clara's days were still full, changing bandages, checking fevers, but she felt the tide pulling her elsewhere. One crisp morning, she folded her few belongings into the worn satchel that had never left her side. She told herself it was time. She had done what she came to do. Others could take it from here. Grant found her on the porch, coat buttoned, bag in hand. Going somewhere? He asked, his voice as even as ever. They don't need me here anymore, she said, avoiding his eyes. He didn't argue. Instead, he gestured for her to follow. They walked in silence past the barns, across the pasture, until they reached a gentle rise. The mountains stretched out in the distance, their peaks dusted with the last of winter's snow. Below, a creek wound through the valley like a silver ribbon. Grant stopped, planting his boots firmly in the grass. Right here, he said. I'll build you a clinic, on my land, with my money. Your name on the door. She turned toward him, startled. Why? His gaze was steady. Stay. Not for me, but for you. So you can do your work your way. No one here will tell you you're unfit. The wind rustled in the grass between them. Clara's fingers tightened on the satchel strap. Then slowly, she let it fall against her leg. All right, she said. Grant's mouth twitched into something just shy of a smile. Then it settled. The first boards for the clinic went up in early summer, their fresh pine scent mingling with the sweet perfume of the meadow grasses. Word had spread quickly, and the townsfolk of Redwillow came without being asked. Men hauling stone for the foundation, women sewing curtains and bedding, children carrying buckets of nails as though they were gold. Clara oversaw the work with the same quiet precision she brought to her patients. She walked the half-frame rooms, already imagining where shelves of tinctures would stand, where a cot would be tucked away for emergencies. Grant was never far, lending his strength to the heavy lifting, though more often he hung back, watching her in the shade of his hat. By the time the roof was laid, the ranch had taken on a new rhythm. The corral still rang with the calls of cow hands and the thud of hooves, but there was another kind of activity now. The murmur of patients waiting in the shade, the clink of jars being set on shelves, the soft patter of small feet in the herb garden. Children followed Clara everywhere, trailing after her like a string of ducklings. Some brought flower petals from the garden, others carried scraps of paper marked with their first shaky letters. She taught them not just their names and numbers, but the uses of mint for stomach aches, chamomile for sleep, and comfrey for healing cuts. Grant, once a man who measured every word, began to loosen. At first he told stories only when pressed, tales of wild horses or a winter so cold his beard froze to his scarf. But soon he was laughing with the ranch hands over supper, trading jests with the children, and lingering beside Clara during community gatherings. One evening, as lanterns glowed along the porch and neighbors shared stew and fresh bread, Grant stood quietly at Clara's side, his presence steady and certain. She glanced up at him and saw not the distant cattle baron who had once carried her from the snow, but a man rooted firmly in the life they had built together. The Holloway Ranch was no longer only a place for cattle. It had become a place where bodies mended, where children learned, and where a guarded man and a determined nurse had found something rare: partnership and a love as steady as the mountains beyond their door. By autumn, the clinic at Holloway Ranch had treated more people than Clara could count. Ranch hands with broken bones, children with fevers, mothers in childbirth, and travelers who'd arrived sick but left with color in their cheeks. Her name had become a byword in Redwillow, spoken with a respect that no diploma could command. One crisp morning, the Township Council sent a formal letter. The paper bore an official seal, but it was the words in plain script that mattered most. The Township of Redwillow recognizes Clara Wynn as head nurse and healer in light of her exceptional service, moral conduct, and bravery in times of crisis. She read it twice, the edges of the page trembling slightly in her hands. Around her, the clinic bustled as usual, but in that moment, she felt the quiet weight of something she had thought forever lost: vindication. Not long after, she and Grant decided to marry. There was no announcement in the papers, no fuss, just an invitation carried by word of mouth. On a clear afternoon, beneath the wide limbs of the old elm tree behind the barn, friends and neighbors gathered. The faces in the small crowd told their own story. The miner whose burns she'd treated after the fire, the widow whose child she'd nursed through pneumonia, the ranch hand who still kept the little sachet of herbs she'd given him years ago. Grant stood tall beside her, his hand warm around hers. There were no elaborate vows, just simple promises, spoken low enough for only each other to hear. When it was done, the crowd clapped softly as if to keep the moment sacred. It was a ceremony without grandeur, but filled with something far greater: gratitude, respect, and a sense that what they'd built together would outlast them both. In the years that followed, the ranch took on a new name, one given by the townsfolk themselves: the Holloway Wynn Homestead of Healing and Fire. It was spoken with a kind of reverence, a reminder of the night Redwillow burned, and the place that had stood as a refuge when the world turned to ash. Patients came from miles away, some on horseback, others in wagons, seeking not only Clara's skill, but the welcome that came with it. No one was turned away, cowhand or banker, settler or drifter. Each was met with the same steady care and the same quiet dignity. The work never truly stopped. By day, the clinic bustled with the rhythm of the frontier's needs, splinting a rancher's leg after a fall, easing a fevered baby's cries, or listening to the worn-out stories of men who just needed someone to hear them. By evening, when the sun dipped behind the mountains and the air turned cool, the pace shifted. Clara would gather the children beneath the sprawling cottonwoods, their branches rustling softly overhead. They learned their letters on scraps of paper, their voices carrying through the yard as they practiced reading aloud. She taught them how to tell mint from nettle, how to bind a cut, how to find clean water in dry land. A short distance away, Grant worked along the fences, mending rails, his deep voice occasionally drifting over as he traded words with the hands. Now and then, he glanced toward the shade of the cottonwoods, watching Clara with the children, a quiet smile touching his face. Together, they had built something that could not be measured in cattle or coin. In a land where history was often carved by guns and power, they had proven it could also be written with hands that refused to give up. Hands that healed, taught, and held fast through every season. And so, the Holloway Wynn Homestead of Healing and Fire stood as more than just a ranch or a clinic. It became a reminder that kindness, courage, and persistence are as much a part of building a legacy as any wealth or power. In today's world, far from the windswept plains of Wyoming, we still face challenges that test our patience, our values, and our compassion. Clara's story reminds us that the labels others put on us, unfit, unworthy, undeserving, don't have to be the final word. Grant's journey shows that even the most guarded hearts can learn to open again, given time and trust. Perhaps the question we carry forward is this: in our own lives, how do we create spaces, like Clara and Grant did, where people are seen for their worth, not their past? Is it through our work, our families, our communities, or maybe simply in the way we choose to treat the next stranger who crosses our path? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Would you have made the same choices Clara did, saving the son of the man who had wronged her? Or would you have walked away? Let's talk about it in the comments. Your perspective might just inspire someone else listening tonight. Thank you for riding with me through this story here on The West That Never Left. If you found something in it worth remembering, whether it was a lesson about forgiveness, perseverance, or the quiet power of love, please give this video a like, share it with someone who might need to hear it, and subscribe so you don't miss the next tale from the heart of the frontier. Because in the end, these stories aren't just about the West that once was. They're about the West that still lives on in all of us.